Hi everyone, welcome back. We're going to finish up our talk about the special senses with this video going over the two senses of hearing and equilibrium. All right, so hearing and equilibrium, not surprisingly, happen in the ear. So your ear has three different regions that we can divide it into. So the external ear, the middle ear, and then the internal ear. Right, so the external ear, so this is the outside part of the ear. So this is going to include everything from the auricle, sometimes called the pinna, but pinna we usually reserve for animals that are not humans that have the ability to kind of like move their ears around. So this is your auricle. External ear also consists of the external auditory canal, which is your ear canal. Right, so here's the auricle, here's the external auditory canal, and here, and along the length of that external auditory canal, you also have a whole bunch of ceruminous glands. So the ceruminous glands make cerumen, which is a fancy name for earwax, and that earwax is there to help protect you, so it's always constantly being produced and then being slowly moved out of the ear so that things don't get stuck in the ear canal, the external auditory canal there. All right, and then the end of the external ear. So the external ear ends in the tympanic membrane. So the tympanic membrane is your eardrum, and that's right there. So that's the tympanic membrane is the barrier between the external ear and the middle ear. Right, so here we can see a little bit better. So we've got the auricle here, we've got the external auditory canal, and then we've got the tympanic membrane here. So everything from that tympanic membrane on out is considered external ear. The middle ear is this region here. This is an air-filled cavity that consists of three bones, and those bones are the malleus, incus, and stapes, sometimes just called the ossicles as a group. Um, so what those bones are doing, they're there to increase the vibration of sound. So they're there to amplify sound. So the malleus, the first bone here, touches the tympanic membrane. So malleus touches the tympanic membrane. The incus touches the malleus, and then the stapes touches the incus. And on the other side of the stapes, we have a structure called the oval window. So the oval window is the other side of the middle ear. So middle ear begins at the tympanic membrane and ends at the oval window. And in between those two structures are your three ossicles, the malleus, incus, and stapes. Also connected to the middle ear here is the auditory tube, sometimes called the eustachian tube. So this auditory tube runs from the middle ear all the way down to your nasopharynx. So it kind of runs it a little bit inferiorly, but mostly medially towards your nasopharynx. Right, and then on the other side of the oval window, we get into the inner ear, which is all this kind of bony structure here, which we'll talk about in a minute. All right, so here's a zoomed in view of the middle ear. So here we can see the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, those three ossicles that kind of bridge this air-filled gap between the tympanic membrane and the oval window. All right, and then here again, we can see the eustachian tube. Eustachian tube, again, is a tube that connects the middle ear to the nasopharynx, which is the upper part of your throat. And the reason for this is basically that sometimes you need to equalize pressure on either side of the tympanic membrane. And so if we need to equalize pressure, say if we're changing altitude, you can open that auditory tube, that eustachian tube, to allow air to pass in so that we can equalize the pressure on either sides of the membrane, which is going to allow the tympanic membrane to vibrate freely rather than being constrained by pressure on the inside of the middle ear. All right, let's talk quickly about the auditory pathway here. So in order to hear, we need to get sound, which is waves in the air. We need to get those waves to make some mechanical changes on the inner ear. So when we go into the inner ear, we're going to be looking at a few different structures. The one associated with hearing is the cochlea. So the cochlea is the main structure of the inner ear that's associated with hearing. Inside the cochlea, we have a cochlear duct, and that cochlear duct is like a coiled duct. So if we look at a cross section of it, it almost looks like a triangular tube. Um, Within that cochlear duct, we've got scala vestibuli and scala tympani, and these are the upper and lower sections, respectively, of that cochlear duct. The roof of the cochlear duct is called the vestibular membrane, sometimes just called Reisner's membrane. And then the floor of the duct is the basilar membrane. On the basilar membrane, we've got a structure called the organ of Corti. So the organ of Corti is actually the structure that's going to transduce waves, mechanical waves, into action potentials that are going to be sent to your brain that you'll interpret as sound. Right, so that's where the action potentials begin. All right, so here is, if we're looking at the cochlea here, so cochlea is right here. It's part of the inner ear. Um, if we look at that cochlear duct and take kind of a cross section of it, we can see these different structures here. So looking at a cross section of the duct itself, we can see the scala vestibuli up here, the scala tympani down here, and then in between those two, within this cochlear duct, we can see the organ of Corti. And again, the organ of Corti is the one that's going to take those sounds and turn the vibrations of the sounds into action potentials. And it does that with these teeny tiny little hairs called stereocilia. So these stereocilia are on the surface here. So when sound waves come in, this whole structure is filled with fluid. When sound waves come in, the fluid is going to act like a wave. So as sound comes in, it's going to create a wave of fluid. As that wave of fluid moves, it's going to move those stereocilia, and movement of the stereocilia there is what's going to trigger the action potential. And it's going to go up your vestibulocochlear nerve into your brain for you to interpret as sound. All right, so here's what the inner ear looks like if we kind of unwind it. So the cochlea looks like a snail, almost like a snail shell. It's very coiled. But if we unroll it and we kind of straighten it out, we get this structure here, right? And so here, this is showing us that different regions within the cochlea are capable of picking up different frequencies of sound. Okay, so if we go at certain places in the cochlea are capable of picking up very low frequency sounds, other places in the cochlea can pick up very high frequency sounds. All right, so the pathway of audition here is that sound waves come in, the auricle, the external ear here is going to catch those sound waves, funnel them down the external auditory canal. Those sound waves are then going to hit the tympanic membrane. As they hit the tympanic membrane, kind of like a drum, the ossicles that are on the inside of the middle ear there are then going to vibrate. So tympanic membrane vibrates. It's going to cause the malleus to vibrate. That's going to cause the incus to vibrate, which causes the stapes to vibrate. The stapes is touching the oval window. And the oval window is the entryway into the cochlea, which is when we finally get into our inner ear. So once we're in the inner ear and the stapes hits that oval window, that's going to send the fluid that's in the inner ear, all that perilymph and endolymph, is going to start circling around. As the fluid moves, it's going to trigger the stereocilia on the organ of Corti, and then the organ of Corti is going to send those nerve impulses to the brain for you to interpret as sound. Right, so here's another look at the inner ear. So here we can see that the inner ear has a few different parts of it. So we've been talking about the cochlea here. So the cochlea, again, is this kind of snail-looking coiled structure, and that cochlea is the only part of your inner ear that is for hearing. The rest of your inner ear is for equilibrium. It has nothing to do with the interpretation of sound. It has to do with balance. All right, so the other two parts of the inner ear here are the vestibule, which is this part here, and the semicircular canals, which are these kind of longer tubes over there. So the vestibule and the semicircular canals are the rest of the inner ear, and those are for balance or equilibrium. All these structures together are completely surrounded by bone, right? So these are basically hollowed out areas within your temporal bone. And sometimes these are called altogether called the bony labyrinth, because it's just a labyrinth of bone on the inside of that bone where we have all these very specialized structures for your special senses. All right, so here we can track that auditory pathway to the brain a little bit better. So as sound comes in, here we can see the oval window. Sound's going to be coming in. It's going to go through the cochlea all the way down. The cochlear branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve is there to receive those action potentials and carry them towards the brain. The other branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve is the vestibular branch. The vestibular branch goes to, as you might imagine, the vestibule, and that's for interpretation of balance. All right, so here's the overview of your auditory pathway one more time. All right, so first step one, we've got sound coming in through the external auditory canal. So those sound waves, just those waves of particles in the air, are going to hit the tympanic membrane. The tympanic membrane is going to vibrate. As it vibrates, it's going to push the malleus and the incus and the stapes to vibrate. As the stapes vibrate, it's going to push on the oval window. So that's, here we are right here, pushing on the oval window. As we push on the oval window, we're going to start to move that fluid that's inside the cochlea. As we move the fluid, it's going to bend the stereocilia that are on the organ of Corti. As we bend those stereocilia, then we trigger action potentials that go to the brain. Now we still have that wave of fluid going through. So the wave is going to go all the way through the cochlea, all the way through all these coils, and eventually it will expend itself on an area called the round window. So the oval window is the doorway in, the round window is the doorway out. All right, let's move on to talking about equilibrium here. So equilibrium is just another word for balance. So this is how you keep your balance. We have two different types of equilibrium, and that's static equilibrium and dynamic equilibrium. So static equilibrium is basically your state of balance relative to gravity. So this is how you know where gravity is pulling on you. Dynamic equilibrium is more about your state of balance when you're moving. So if you do a sudden movement, your dynamic equilibrium is what lets you catch yourself so you don't fall down. All right, so, and we mentioned the structures associated with this are the vestibule and the semicircular canals. All right, if we look down here at this vestibule, we'll notice that the vestibule is divided into two different parts, the saccule and the utricle. So saccule and utricle right here are both part of the vestibule. Those are going to be important for static equilibrium. All right, so here's how static equilibrium works. So again, static equilibrium is just telling your body where your head is in relation to gravity. So as I move my head side to side, inside the saccule and the utricle of my vestibule, I have these tiny little structures called macula. So macula within them have tiny little fluid and tiny little stones inside that fluid that are called otoliths, which literally means ear stones. So the otoliths are there to respond to gravity. As my head moves to this side, so if we look at this guy who's tilting his head forward, the force of gravity is pushing in this direction. All these little tiny stones are going to push on nerve endings. And as the nerve endings feel the stones pulling on them, that's how they interpret that the head is being tilted to this side, or the head's being tilted to that side, or it's forward or backward. It lets us know where the head is in relationship to gravity. Right. And then as far as dynamic equilibrium, so dynamic equilibrium, again, is more like when you're trying to maintain balance when you're moving, when you're spinning around, when you're dancing, when whatever you're doing. As you're spinning around, dynamic equilibrium happens in the semicircular canals. All right, so where static equilibrium happens in the vestibule, dynamic equilibrium happens in the semicircular canals. So as we look at these semicircular canals, first of all, notice that there are three. So we have three different semicircular canals and they're at right angles to one another. Each semicircular canal has a kind of expanded like region called an ampulla. And within that ampulla, there's a structure called a cupula. So if we I've sort of circled one of these ampulla down here. This is a blown up version of it right here. So this kind of swollen part of the semicircular canal is the ampulla. Inside that is a structure called the cupula. Cupula is basically like a flap of gel that's going to respond again to the pull of in this case inertia. So not gravity, but inertia. So as you move in one direction, this gel gets kind of dragged behind you. So as you're moving, those all of the cupulas within the ampulla of each one of the semicircular canals is going to respond differently depending on the direction of movement. All right, so here's kind of another view of what we're looking at here. So 3 semicircular canals, 3 ampulla here, and then within each of those ampulla, we've got the cupula. Inside the cupula, then we've got tiny little hair cells, and those hair cells are what is actually triggering the action potential. So those are the actual nerve cells that are capable of picking up this movement. So as the cupula responds to inertia as you're moving, it's going to trigger those hair cells to generate action potentials and send them to your brain so that you can understand how you're moving in space. All right, so a few questions here. What is the structure that separates the external ear from the middle ear? Where are the stapes, incus, and the malleus located? The eustachian tube connects what two structures? And the cochlea, semicircular canals, and the vestibule are collectively called what? And then what part of the ear do we find them in? All right, so the answers here, what separates the external and middle ear is the tympanic membrane, otherwise known as your eardrum. Stapes, incus, and malleus are in the middle ear. The eustachian tube connects that middle ear to the nasopharynx, which is the top of your throat. And then the cochlea, semicircular canals, vestibule, those are all together called the bony labyrinth, which is in the inner ear. Okay, so of the cochlea, vestibule, and semicircular canals, which structure converts sound to nervous signals? So which one is concerned with sound? What part of the inner ear is responsible for maintaining balance? And then which of your cranial nerves is the vestibulocochlear nerve? All right, so which structure converts sound to nervous signals is the cochlea. So cochlea is the only part of your inner ear that deals with sound. The part of the inner ear responsible for balance is both the vestibule for static equilibrium and semicircular canals for dynamic equilibrium. And then which cranial nerve is the vestibulocochlear? That is cranial nerve 8. So I hope this was helpful. Let me know if you have questions.